so much me. So my name is Katie Wilhelm. I am a graduate assistant over at SARC. I work primarily with a supplemental instruction program, which we'll go into in a few minutes. But basically, supplemental instruction, or SI, are 4 weekly group study sessions that are led by students who've taken usually a lot of the lower level STEM classes, as well as some of the upper levels as well. And they have received an A in the class, and so they lead these group study sessions geared towards how the professor teaches, the material the professor goes over. So that's kind of, it's like tutoring, but a little different in that regard. So that's kind of what I do in my role. So like I mentioned earlier, the goals of today is just to kind of cover what SARC is, what SARC offers. I know some of you are transfer students, so kind of a good introduction to SARC if you're not already familiar with us. We're going to go into what I mentioned earlier, the 5 types of studying, because there are 5 types of studying, and that really kind of will be able to encompass a lot of the questions and answers you might already, or questions I should say, that you're already coming into today's workshop with. We'll go into some kind of more basic test preparation tips as well as some questions and answers in the end. I know some of you may be required to be here, and you might have a form or something like that that I need to sign to prove that you were here. I'll sign all of that at the end. And then someone mentioned Linkloot earlier, so this is eligible for Linkloot. If you've ever heard of like the Goose Chase app, it's an app that's run through the Linkloot aspect of things, so you can get points via that as well. So just to throw that in there. Cool. Well, basically, just to go over SARC at first, so I mentioned SI earlier. So SI is kind of held all across campus. We reserve different classrooms for it 4 different times a week for all the respective sessions. We're finalizing the schedule now, so the schedule will be posted on the SARC website within the next week or so. We also offer peer tutoring. Peer tutoring is housed in our main office, which is in Howard Phillips Hall, as well as in CECS, which is in one of the engineering buildings, as well as VARC, which is the Veterans Academic Resource Center. So we offer tutoring for a lot of the same subjects that we offer SI for, as well as some different subjects as well. So even though, that was weird. So even though so we offer tutoring in those 3 locations. Even though the one is in VARC, you don't have to be a veteran to use the services within VARC. It's just one of the locations that we use. And so tutoring is more of a drop-in, a couple hours a week type service, drop-in, drop-out. So that's a little bit more your style. That's also an option available to you. We do several academic success workshops throughout the semester, such as this one. We also do some that are catered towards just time management, one that's just test anxiety. We do another version of this one towards finals, a little bit more geared to finals in particular. So we have a couple different topics we do throughout the semester. We also do ACE, which is academic coaching and engagement, which is kind of one-on-one support with a peer mentor to get some more individualized, some more regular support to work on like study skills and test prep on a more individual level, so based off of like your particular classes or your particular lifestyle. And then the other 2 things we offer, the learning skills consultations is a lot like the peer mentoring or the peer coaching through ACE, except it's a one-time appointment. So if you wanted to sit down for a 1-hour individual appointment with someone like me to kind of go over how perhaps what we go over today applies to you specifically in your specific classes, your specific like lifestyle or case or anything of that nature, we can, you just make an appointment for what we call learning skills consultation just by calling the SARC office. And then we also offer a lot of online support. So that's basically, like I mentioned earlier, today's workshop is being live streamed and then posted online on the SARC YouTube channel. We also have a lot of online worksheets, additional videos, things of that nature that you're free to go on at any point 24/7, and it's entirely free to you. So that's kind of SARC in a 3 to 5 minute nutshell. Does anyone have any questions about the different services that SARC has to offer? Yes.
I know I've heard of the supplemental instruction
Yeah.
before.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have them for certain classes, right?
Yes.
So do you guys have anything for political sciences or where I could go to get?
Cool. Unfortunately, we don't have any for political science, and we are a little bit more STEM focused in that regard. Just they're typically the classes that have the highest drop, fail, withdrawal rate. I always struggle saying that word. However, you still can call into the SARC office and see if one of our tutors or SI leaders would like to private tutor you. It is separate from SARC entirely, but we can potentially match you with someone who might, in addition to a STEM class, also have political science experience and can still work with you. But that's just kind of a networking thing. What they choose to do is outside of SARC, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
Do you know if there's any like other I don't know, offices that I can go to?
There is the writing center for the more like writing side of things, because I'm assuming you probably are going to have to write a lot in political science, so they'll be able to give you a lot more of like the writing support. I'm not sure of any of like true like political science tutoring, if that's what you're asking as well. But your professors would be able to connect you to any more political science specific resources. Cool. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Does anyone have any other questions related to SARC? Cool. Cool. So we're basically just going to jump right into the 5 types of studying. So my favorite question to ask all of you is, did you know there's 5 types of studying? Cool. Cool. Sometimes there's always like one person that almost says yes or maybe, and I'm always a little surprised. But so it makes it, so basically, here are the 5 types of studying, and so we'll go into all 5 in more detail. So they're basically gathering, learning, gathering learning information, checking for learning, refreshing that information, and then kind of overall improving your learning skills or improving your study skills. So kind of all of what we're going to go over today falls under one of these 5 types. Cool. So the first step is studying to gather information, and this is kind of the step that you're probably already doing without really knowing that you're doing it. So this is where you're simply going to class, you're reading your textbook, or even at minimum have your textbook, you have class notes, you have whatever might already be uploaded to web courses. Basically, you have all the information that you need in front of you, or you have the ability to get the information that you need, and it's all available to you. That's just kind of the aspect of gathering information. And you've kind of started to read over it. Maybe you've taken notes one time, kind of a general overview of all the information. That's kind of the first type of studying. And for the most part, you're probably already doing that. You probably have attended class, right? We're all going to class. Awesome. You're probably already maybe not taking really detailed notes, but at least you're probably reading the textbook, or at least skimming it, hopefully. Yes? Yes? Not quite as enthusiastic on that one, but we'll work on that. But yeah, and so this is where it's literally simply gathering information. That's just kind of the first type, and you're probably already doing it to at least some extent without realizing it. This is where it's also a good idea to start, especially let's say you miss a class, you're sick or you slept in or something of that nature. Make sure that you're checking in with classmates to get any notes that you missed, checking in with your professor as well, just because you want to make sure that you have all the information available to you once you're further into the other types of studying, or the closer that you get to exams, because it's a lot harder to scramble for information closer to exams as opposed to now when you might still have a couple weeks until your first exam. Does anyone have any questions with regard to the first type? I know it's kind of a little bit more, one of the more easier, a little bit more basic type, but cool. Cool. So the second type is studying to learn information. So this is kind of the bulk of it. So this, the second step and the third step are the ones that you're going to be spending the majority of your time on. So the first type, the first one, the gathering information, you're doing throughout the semester. So like whenever you're going to class and being introduced to new information, you're gathering more information. This is also the second step, learning information, is also happening throughout the semester. So as you're introduced to information for the first time, whether it's via lecture or via reading or however else you're learning information in your prospective class, the key here is reciting information or repeating the information, whether that's taking notes multiple times, using flashcards, which I personally really like, talking it out with friends in the class, just kind of whatever, we'll go into some of those in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but basically whatever you're doing, just do it a lot, do it often, repeat it, because the most easiest way to remember information is simply repeating it. That's just the easiest way that your brain learns information, is seeing it more than once, basically. And then more often, as we'll also get into it a little bit later, you're more likely to forget information if you don't continuously repeat it to yourself in however way you see fit. Cool. And so one thing that I really like about flashcards in particular is that you can really sort the information kind of in things that you already know and things that you don't need to know. And so this is kind of the step where you start doing that sorting. So as you're continuously, like you're reviewing notes, you're taking notes, reviewing notes, things of that nature, you probably have some idea of what is coming pretty easily for you and what just isn't. And you can kind of sort accordingly. So obviously if you understand this one concept, this other concept is still like Swahili to you, you might need to spend more time on that whole like Swahili concept, for example, or whatever you aren't quite understanding. And kind of to narrow it down, the one thing that we always say, or at least we recommend, is that you study for at least 2 hours per credit hour that you're enrolled in per week. So basically, if you're in a 3 credit hour class, that means 3 times 2 in that regard. So approximately 6 hours of studying outside of class per week. We usually recommend to bump that number up to 3 for STEM-related classes, just because there's usually a little bit more problem solving, a little bit more in-depth work that you have to do for those classes. So that is a lot of time when you're taking, especially if you're taking a full-time course load. So that's where time management also comes into play. So that's kind of where this step does take the longest, in that you're utilizing a lot of those 2 to 3 hours per credit hour a week. But it's really, yeah. And then another thing too, is making sure that whenever questions come up, that you're utilizing your resources. So like I mentioned, going to professor earlier, comparing notes to classmates, make sure that you're doing that throughout the whole process to make sure that as you're repeating information or continuously reciting or continuously reviewing it, that you're aware of, that you're kind of reviewing the correct information, if that makes sense. So if there's something that you're not getting from the beginning, make sure that you have the correct information in front of you so that you can continue to review the correct information as opposed to the incorrect information. Does that all make sense? I feel like I rambled a little bit there, but cool. What are all of your thoughts so far? Any questions, comments, concerns? Some head shakes.
Can you repeat that last part of like
Yeah.
getting the correct information?
Yeah, so basically it kind of emphasizes the point of making sure that if you have any questions that come up or you miss something, to go to your professor, compare notes to classmates, things of that nature, just so that like if you miss something, you're not like learning the information with that concept missed. So just do what you have to do in order to get all of the concepts just laid out in front of you, kind of going back to that first step of gathering the information. Cool. I think the third step goes a little bit more into the how to do it, in case that might be a little bit more what you're looking for. Okay, so basically, the third step is checking for learning. So this is where, let's say you've taken notes, you've made the flashcards, you've compared notes with classmates, you've asked your professor questions. This is where you need to start to see, what do you really know? Maybe you think you know everything, and that's great, and then the one thing we really recommend is self-testing yourself. So whether you have access to like previous test questions or practice problems, or you can have a friend ask you questions about a certain concept. Self-testing is really key, because that's where you can kind of mimic the testing environment and really see like, okay, this is test day. I got this question, I got this problem right about this concept. I would get this down if I was taking the test today, I would get it. Or actually, maybe I wouldn't get the question if you're getting it wrong at this point. And then I can help you kind of narrow down your focus from there. This is also a really good time to learn the test format. So especially, we're still early on in the semester, you may or may not have taken a test yet in your respective classes. So this is a good time to see, are your tests all multiple choice, or are they all short answer, or are they essays, perhaps in a political science class? Kind of get to know, find out the format of all of your tests now, so you can kind of prepare accordingly. So if every test that you're taking is all going to be in multiple choice format, try to find practice problems to work with that are also multiple choice, so that you can mimic the test as much as possible, so you can see if you're able to recall the information in the format that it's most likely going to be presented to you on test day. Does that all make sense? Cool. And another really good tip here is trying to teach someone else the information. So if you're taking like Biology 1 and you're on the phone with your grandmother who's never taken biology in her life, walk her through like what a cell is and what like all of the parts to a cell is, because she'll probably ask a lot of perhaps basic or maybe not so basic questions about what things are. And if you have the ability to explain to your grandmother or just someone who literally has no biology knowledge whatsoever what a cell is, what all the parts are, what they all do and everything like that, if you have that ability to do that, then you probably know the information really well, and you're probably going to be able to replicate that as appropriately on the test. Now, if your grandmother's asking you, okay, what's a cell, and you realize you can't answer that question to her, then there might be some more reviewing that you need to do. So that's one thing that I really like, in addition to flashcards, is just teaching someone else who really has no knowledge on the material. And then who has the ability to ask you even just basic questions about it, because that's really the best way to see, do I really know the information? Does that all make sense? Has anyone done that before? So I saw like a so-so, but some head shakes. That's my homework to all of you, is to try teaching someone, perhaps whatever is your first test coming up this semester, teach someone who's not taking that class some material from it. And that's really if you have the ability to do that pretty easily, then you're probably good for the test. And if you're struggling with that, then you kind of know what to review moving forward. And that's all basically the third step is those are a couple ways to really check to see what you've learned. Any questions so far? Cool. So the fourth type, this is where we're kind of getting a little bit closer to test day. Maybe we're test week, or maybe the week before test week. So basically, this is where we've spent a lot of time focusing on the information that we were struggling with. So maybe you taught your friend the material, you realized what you weren't able to answer that well, and then you went back, you refreshed it for yourself. Now that we're closer to test day, we want to make sure that we actually know the information that we thought we knew from the beginning. So maybe you told grandmother what like a cell was, and then you nailed that pretty well, and then you went on to talk about some more complex biology terms. And then come test week, because you haven't been thinking about cells in a week, maybe you started to forget the information about cells. So this is where you want to make sure to go back, even just a quick read through your notes or read through your flashcards, just to make sure oh yeah, I remember what a cell is. It's XYZ. Now, if you suddenly realize that you don't remember it just because you haven't been focusing on it the last couple weeks, that could be some material to focus on during your last week of studying, if that makes sense. Cool. I'm going to time check on that. Cool. And so the one thing we do suggest is to review information about 2 to 3 times a week. So that's why flashcards are bless you, by the way. That's why flashcards are really great, because you have the ability to kind of flip through them wherever you are, like on a bus, like at home, like between classes. Just kind of flip through them 2 to 3 times a week. And kind of self-test yourself in that regard, just to kind of make sure that even if you thought you knew something earlier in the semester, to kind of make sure that you still know it. This will become very important for the test to have cumulative finals. So right now we're still early in the semester. You're probably still covering a lot more basic information in that regard. But as the semester goes on, concepts will start to build off of each other, might build off concepts that you're learning right now. So you want to make sure that you still know what might be the basics early on. So that when you're studying for your cumulative final at the end of the semester, you've been reviewing everything throughout the semester, and you still have a good grasp on the information that was taught to you even the first week of classes. Sound good? Awesome. Does anyone have any questions now that we've gone through the four of the types? Yes?
How early do you suggest to study for the final? Like 2 weeks before the final?
Can you repeat the first part of that question? I'm sorry.
Reviews before the final?
Reviews?
Like how early do you suggest?
Yeah, so basically for finals, assuming cumulative,
Yes.
yeah. It's kind of going back to you're studying for your final basically throughout the semester. So it's a lot of what we're covering right now, but just continuously. So maybe you have a test in this first, and like let's say Bio 1 next week. You're probably going to be focused on whatever's going to be covered in that Bio 1 test for next week, understandably. But even once that test is over, still continue to review that same material throughout the semester. So there isn't necessarily anything totally special or totally different. It's just continuously reviewing the information throughout the semester. Even if you think you don't really need to, or you want to give yourself a little bit of a break, still do it, because you'll find that come finals week, if you're doing it throughout the semester, everything's going to come to you a lot faster than it will be cramming all the information in at the end. Yeah, so it's nothing really different. It's just continuous throughout the semester. Awesome. Any other questions? Cool. Well, the fifth type of studying kind of goes into, well, actually, this is actually a good segue to also continue your question about kind of the finals. So there's a lot of different reasons why we also forget information. I've hinted at a couple of them earlier, but basically a lot of this has to do with like interference and mental overcrowding and underlearning and disuse. This is where you remember information when you continuously use it. So that goes back to the repetition that I have been mentioning kind of purposely, repeating that information because you need, in order to learn information, it needs to be repeated to you or repeat it to yourself. Because you need to be able to use the information in order, that was weird. In order to, you need to be able to use the information in order to learn it. So one of the most common ways we forget information is simply by not using it. Another way is to kind of, we learn information, let's say it's presented, kind of going back to the multiple choice and short answer manner in which we're tested. If we're only used to, if we have information presented to us only in multiple choice form, but then suddenly it's presented in a short answer question, you might realize that maybe you don't actually learn the information because you're used to it being presented to you in a multiple choice format, but now they're in a short answer where you kind of have to generate a little bit more of the information yourself. You might struggle a little bit more. So another way that's really common to forget information is just because the clues or the cues that you might have to like remember information get changed, if that makes sense. So kind of the way to combat that is to kind of learn information as many different ways as possible. So if there's different ways to go about all the different things that a cell is, if you can just present it A in the multiple choice format, but also in the short answer, also in the essay. If you have the ability to kind of present it in multiple ways, that kind of combats the changed clue aspect of that. And then the interference, the mental overcrowding, and the effort and intention lacking. Everything that I've been talking about today, or even just like studying in general, it takes time. And like I mentioned earlier, the 2 to 3 hours per credit hour per week, that's a lot of time. And that also requires a lot of effort. And without putting in that time, without putting in that effort, a lot of this just, it's going to be a lot more easier for you to forget information just because the effort is lacking or the time is lacking. Or maybe something else is going on in your life that might be potentially getting in the way. So maybe something's going on in your life that's really stressful and that is understandably getting in the way of your focus. Or maybe you are taking a full course load of information and just cramming 3 to 4, like 4 to 5 classes of information all in your head throughout the semester. Maybe that is a lot of information all at once. And so that's another reason why people might forget information, just because there is so much going on. And there's a few different ways to combat that. One way is to kind of prioritize your commitments, prioritize kind of in the moment, what are you focusing on? For me in particular, I know that I can tell myself, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to study for this particular class, and then as I'm studying, a like random thought will cross my mind of, oh, I need to pay rent, or oh, like this is happening in my life. Just kind of like those passing thoughts that end up distracting me from what I'm already doing. And it's an important thing. Like I need to pay rent, I need like a place to live. But because it's crossing my mind during study time, it's drawing my focus away from studying all at the same time. And kind of what I do to combat that is I have what I call like a worry sheet laid out next to me as I'm studying. So if I'm focused on studying and then that whole like, okay, you need to pay rent by tomorrow thing crosses my mind, I'll write that down on that worry sheet. And then once I'm done studying, I'll do something about it. So like I'll go and pay rent or I'll go deal with whatever else crossed my mind. The key there is actually that follow through. So if you're telling yourself, okay, I will address that worry when it's time to address it, but the time is not right now, then your brain will just kind of more naturally calm down in that regard. Now, if I told myself I'm going to pay rent, write it down on the sheet, and then I don't pay rent, then I might be a little bit more worried the next time I'm sitting down studying and I realize I need to pay rent because last time I didn't pay rent and I might have other issues going on in my life at that point. So that's just kind of like what I personally do. I've heard a lot of students have like kind of copied that and really thought that was really effective for them as well. So that's kind of another like little homework thing for you, that just to try that out, see if that works for you. It may or may not. But that's just kind of a way to navigate focusing and potentially avoiding forgetting information. Cool. Kind of going off all of that, does anyone have any tips that they might use themselves to kind of address maybe any of the reasons we might forget information, or maybe more particular kind of overcrowding or things of that nature? Yes. Go to a quiet environment, definitely. We're going to talk about some like more general studies tips in a few minutes, and that's definitely one of them. Awesome. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I personally try to avoid like studying in my room because then I'll get too comfortable and then just want to go to sleep. So
Definitely.
yeah, I'm still trying to find like the right like study spot for me. So hopefully
Definitely.
some recommendations.
Definitely. We have a slide about distractions in a few slides that kind of being in your own room, it's associated with whatever is going on in your life. So even if you have the ability to just like focus on your computer or whatnot, you're more naturally going to associate your personal life with your room because it's your room. So if anything is going on in your life, it's just going to cross your mind more naturally in your room. But if you're anywhere else, it's less likely to cross your mind just because it's not, you just don't make that association. My favorite suggestion that I've ever heard from a student is that she always goes to IHOP to study, and she gets a booth. She'll buy like coffee or maybe like pancakes, because you know it's IHOP, and she'll sit there. I don't know how long, but for several hours potentially. She'll do her homework. Apparently they have free Wi-Fi, so that's something you need. Like, it's there. And then she has coffee. She has food. You have a nice booth to like spread out at. I would have never thought of that myself, but that's something. Apparently it's right down the street from her house, so be creative in that regard. And so what also might work for someone might not necessarily work for you, but be creative. You might find some nice little spots that people might not always think of. Cool. So we've gone over the 4 types of studying. We kind of haven't touched the 5th one yet. So the 5th one is kind of an interesting one because it kind of bends the definition of studying a little bit, because this is where you've taken a test, or maybe you've already taken a quiz, or you've done homework in your class right now, and you've gotten some sort of feedback. And so maybe let's say you take the first test, and maybe you didn't do so well. Maybe you got like a C, and you thought you could get a B or an A on in that test. This is where you kind of figure out, okay, what went wrong and what can I change? So this is where you kind of look at the different concepts. So let's see, maybe you taught your grandmother what a cell was, and therefore you got all the cell questions correctly, but whatever else was on that test that you didn't teach your grandmother, maybe you didn't do so well in those questions. So that tells me, okay, that teaching someone else strategy was really effective for you, and maybe to do that for more concepts for the next test. And you've used this first test to kind of play around with that to see what works for you. Likewise, a lot of times tests will include information that were covered only in lecture or only in the textbook, or vice versa. Maybe there was some overlap, but usually you can kind of tell if something was presented in lecture, maybe it was easier for you to recall the information versus something that might have only been presented in a textbook. And you can kind of use the first test to see, okay, where did I learn information from the easiest? And then you can kind of know where to spend more time studying the next test. So maybe if you struggled with the textbook related questions, maybe it's worth spending some more time with your textbook going on to the second test. Make sense? Cool. And this is kind of where Also, utilizing campus resources. So maybe you didn't seek out tutoring, SI, or anything that Stark or another department offers. Maybe this is a good time to do it now that you've seen kind of where you might have struggled a little bit. An awesome way about attending these resources, not only to review the concepts in that particular class, but to see what other students in that class are doing. So maybe you didn't think about going to IHOP to study, but maybe everyone in your class does. And so maybe that's something you can try and it seems to be working for them. Maybe it's gonna work for you too. So kind of connect with others in your class to see what they're doing and try it out. It might work for you, it might not, but it's always worth a try. Cool. So that was kind of the 5 types of studying. I know the 5th one kind of bends the definition of studying a bit just because it's not true like in looking at a textbook studying. It's really just kind of using feedback and adjusting accordingly. A lot of students typically don't do this step or they don't really think to, or they might not think it's worth the time to spend on it. But I think this is probably one of the most important type, if not the most important type, because this is where you really can see what's working best for you, not what's working best for like your neighbor or your roommate or whoever else is in the class. This is all about you, and then making it, therefore, customizing how you study throughout the rest of the semester accordingly. Maybe you got 100% on your test, and therefore you got everything right. Keep it up. Like now you know what you need to do for future tests, and this is kind of your check-in time. But yeah, so that was kind of the 5 types of studying. We're going to go into some more like test prep, like general tips next. But does anyone have any questions before we move on? Cool. Cool. So we hinted at the proper studying environment earlier. Someone said they need to be in a quiet environment to study. I mentioned the whole IHOP thing. We talked about studying in our rooms and how maybe that could work out for some people, but it makes it really easy to be distracted by whatever else is going on in your life. So what the proper environment looks like can look very different for some people. Some people might really need that quiet environment, or some people might need some background noise, just something that maybe being too quiet is just too distracting for them. And that's kind of where you know yourself best to know what works best for you. That's weird. Likewise, maybe you need your computer to study. Maybe like you have a PDF of the textbook, maybe you need web courses, you need the PowerPoints, so you might very well need your laptop or computer, tablet, or whatever you have. But in the case that you don't, maybe you do get a little too distracted by it because you can go on Netflix and then 3 hours later you're 3 episodes into Grey's Anatomy and then you're sobbing because that's what I do. So there's an app that I've used personally, it's called Self-Control. So that is where you can literally put in the URLs for websites that are likely to distract you. So let's say Netflix.com, Facebook.com, whatever might distract you. And then you can set kind of a timer on it. So you have the ability to be like, I'm going to block Netflix off of my computer for the next 3 hours because I need to study for 3 hours. And then once it's set, unless you have some very high-tech computer science background that's way beyond me, you can't undo that timer until that time is up. So now now that you've blocked your distractions, it's a lot more easier for you to focus because there's literally no way for you to go on Netflix unless you have a really high computer science background that I don't have. But that's just kind of another thing that I use personally. I'm a very Apple person, so I know I use it on the Apple side of things. I do believe it's still available on Windows as well. There also might be some variations of it available across other types of computers, other types of devices that also might be worth exploring. I just personally use Self-Control, but that's just me. And yeah. Does anyone have any comments about what they might use in their study environment or any tips that they might use specifically that help them kind of create their own proper study environment? Yes.
I haven't used it recently,
Mhm.
but maybe it'll work really well for other people.
Yeah.
But it's this app called Habitica.
Okay.
Habit, ICA.
Yeah.
And basically, you kind of make a character, and you can level up by completing tasks.
Mhm.
It's kind of on the honor system
Mhm.
because you add the tasks yourself for the habits that you want to create.
Mhm.
You can check those off as you complete them.
Mhm.
And then you'll gain points.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can, get pets, and you can get pets. And,
Yeah, yeah.
and you can write your pets in your little avatar.
Yeah.
And so it's a really cool way to think of life as a game, I guess.
Yeah, it can motivate yourself. So yeah, so it might not work for everyone, but it could work for someone. Definitely, I need to try that out. That sounds fun. You know, was it habit?
ICA, so
I
habit.
see. Okay, cool. I'll look into that myself. Cool. Any other things that you all might have used? Yes.
I feel like yoga music or like
Yeah.
Indian flute music.
Yeah.
It's like really stimulating to your brain.
Definitely, yeah. I know a lot of people also mention classical music for study. There is like studies that show that it does help with studying everything, but I know for me personally, I like the quiet, steady environment, so I would be really annoyed if I had music on in the background, but that's just me. Could work for someone else or might not work for someone else. It really just depends. I probably use my email. That's probably what that is because that would make sense why it's going off because I get a lot of emails. Cool. So the next part is kind of avoiding distractions. So kind of what I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things out there that probably distract you. So there's probably the whole Netflix and social media thing too, like I mentioned earlier. There might just, another thing too, is sleep. Because we all do need sleep, and 8 hours of sleep or in that 7 to 9 hour range, like, is so important and unrelated to everything else that I said today. Like, make sure that you're sleeping because all of this is not going to work out for you if you're not sleeping. So put that out there. But if you're studying in bed, it's a lot more likely for you to fall asleep while you're studying. And although you need that sleep, you also probably need to study also. It's a trade-off, but making sure that you're in an environment where that doesn't necessarily promote sleep unless that's what you're trying to do. So kind of going back to if you're in your room and you associate being in your room with sleeping, because that's probably one of the things that you do in your room, just a guess there, that you're like, if you're falling asleep, you're not going to be able to focus in that regard. So even if it's simply as moving out to like your living room, if you are at home, physically going somewhere else, to the library, Starbucks, even IHOP, removing yourself from wherever you might drift off in that regard is definitely important. Another thing with my phone in particular, I've actually never tried out. I've heard mixed things about whether self-control worked on their phone or not, so I'm not sure if it's something that can block apps on your phone as well. But I know I'm really distracted just by like texting and things of that nature, so I'll purposely like throw my phone at the very top of my closet to the point that I can't get it down unless I get my chair and like stand on my chair and reach up for it. And that's just an annoying hassle, so I won't do it until I actually really, really need my phone or really, really want my phone. And even then I still probably won't do it because it's more effort than I think it's worth. So that's just something that I do personally, that if I know since I know I will be distracted by my phone, I literally throw it away. I throw it like to the point that I can't like access it while I'm studying. So maybe you need to have access to your phone because someone in your family is going to call you or things of that nature. So obviously adjust that accordingly how it applies to your life. But if you know that your phone is something that's going to distract you, adjust accordingly so that put it somewhere that maybe it won't distract you as much. Does anyone have any tips that they use in particular to kind of avoid common or maybe even not so common distractions? Are these things kind of what distract you? Is there anything else that might distract you when you're trying to study? Very talkative bunch. Oh, there. Lights come on. Yeah.
Yeah, I turn off my phone.
Mhm.
And then after about a good half an hour, 45 minutes, I just feel like I'm probably missing something.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of want to turn it on again.
Yeah.
But turning it off or putting it somewhere out of your sight is a good help.
Mhm. Definitely.
Opposite out.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I saw your hand.
The big distractions for me are like in the past has been like YouTube videos.
Mhm.
And so like sometimes as a break I might be like, okay, I'll just watch one video, and then like 5 videos later and
Right.
I'm like, oh no.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So like I know that if I just say like just one video, I know I'm not gonna do just one
Yeah.
video. So I've just been saying no videos at all, and so far that's been helping.
Mhm.
So like knowing yourself.
Yeah.
Like,
Definitely.
Like how like you behave
Yeah.
Distractions is important.
Definitely. We do recommend study breaks too, so kind of 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off. I know that's kind of a common thing that is often said, but even if you find something to watch in like that 10-minute time span that fits in there, it's so easy to drift off. Kind of what I said with the whole Grey's Anatomy thing. Yeah, don't even get me started. So know yourself well and know what will distract you. So maybe social media isn't a part of your life and you're therefore not going to be distracted by that. That's great, but there might be something that will distract you. So kind of know yourself to know how that you're going to respond to that distraction. And then with regard to some tips about, let's say we're at test day and you've studied, you've done everything, you've taken all the suggestions, you've figured out what works well, what might not work out for you. But we're here on test day. So here's a couple tips with regards to kind of what to do on test day in particular. So kind of what I actually don't think is on here, but make sure that you're getting to the test room at least 5 minutes before, if not as much time as you possibly can beforehand, because you want to make sure that you people can get yourself, you can sit down, get yourself situated, get out pens, pencils, whatever you need for that respective test. Because that's one thing that if you're rushing to that test, I'm so sorry, I have so many emails apparently. If you're rushing to get to the test, you're just going to enter that test in a very kind of like anxious time frame. And then it's going to be so much more harder for you to get yourself focused and in the mindset to take the test if you're just mentally distracted. So get yourself to the room as early as possible. Get yourself situated. Calm yourself down in the few minutes before the test. So don't review information in those last few minutes, because even though it might get something into your short-term memory, it might not be worth the stress or the anxiety that it might bring up for you. But that kind of goes back to knowing yourself. So if you do get highly anxious in this test situation, definitely take it easy in the few minutes before the test. Some of these are pretty basic, but they're still really important tips. Making sure that you're reading the question fully, as well as each answer choice fully, especially if it's multiple choice. There's always those little words like but or and or that really make or break what is the correct answer, and they are really easy to miss those words if you are just skimming the answers. So it does seem like a basic tip, but it is a really important one to make sure that you keep doing. The process of elimination is another important one. Also kind of probably basic, you've probably heard it before, but it is something that really does help narrow down your answer choices, as well as skipping a question that might be too difficult for you and coming back to it later, because you might know, sometimes there might be some other questions on the test that might hint at the answer to another question, and so if there's something that you're struggling with up front, you might be able to kind of have those mental cues come up later in the test. Making sure that you're budgeting your time is always important. So I always like to say, when you receive your test, read through it really quickly to have some idea of, okay, there's 20 questions, I have 50 minutes, I can do the math really fast, I have a couple minutes per question, leave some room at the end to review the answers. That's what I do personally, so I can kind of mentally budget my time to know how much time I have on each question. But then there's also some individuals who doing that might be too anxiety provoking to them. They might see, oh my God, there's 20 questions and I'm already struggling on the first one. Maybe that's just going to cause you too much anxiety, and maybe it's best for you to take a step back from that tip. That kind of goes back to what was mentioned earlier, knowing yourself best, knowing what you can handle in that exact moment. Getting enough sleep and eating well, so basic self-care in that regard, but especially also eating. I know I've emphasized sleeping earlier, but make sure that you do have a healthy breakfast in the morning of a test. I know you've probably been told that since elementary school, but that's just one of those really important things that you really need to make sure that you're doing if you really want to be successful on the test. Kind of also the never changing your answer unless you're absolutely sure that it's incorrect. I know that's another probably basic tip, but it's also super important because you're more likely, oftentimes your first instinct was the correct one. And then sometimes you might kind of internally talk yourself out of the answer. Maybe as you're taking more, maybe as you're seeing more of the test, you're like, but wait, maybe that wasn't actually correct. Honestly, it probably was correct if that was your first instinct. So it's really trusting your first instincts. And unless maybe you read at the math and you realize the math was actually incorrect or something like that. So unless you have a very factual thing to tell you that it's incorrect, don't change your initial answer. Cool. Does anyone else have any other quick tips that might not have been reflected on these last couple slides? Were these kind of all-encompassing? Do you agree with them, disagree with them? See a lot of head nods there. Yeah. Okay.
Would you say if revising the test after you're done
Yeah.
would benefit or no, since I might change my...
So that's where it's good to still kind of make sure you answered everything correctly, or at least answered every question. So sometimes, especially if you are skipping around, you want to make sure that you at least at minimum answered every question. It's usually, especially for more problem-solving classes or tests, if there's a lot of math involved, that's where maybe you know how to answer it, but you just miss a negative sign or something like that. If you have the time to maybe redo the math, and then you have it in front of you to be like, oh yeah, I actually missed that negative sign, and you have the time to compare and contrast, and now that you have it written down in front of you that it's incorrect, then maybe that's an opportunity to change your answer. But if it's just one of those things where you're kind of looking at it and you're like, but maybe it's this, if you're kind of going down that thought process, that's where you need to take a step back and be like, I'm going to go with my first answer. Does that make sense? Awesome. Saw a hand right behind her. You agree with them? Awesome. Any other thoughts? Cool. A couple more slides. Another thing that's just really important is developing a UCF support team. So this is kind of where using your different campus resources to your advantage. So I talked about SARC. I talked about everything we have to offer. A lot of individual departments have some of their own academic resources that relate to their respective classes. So also use your professors to their advantage. They can usually connect you with people that maybe were successful in the class. They can give you some tips, or maybe they can just give you some tips on how to succeed in their own class. Utilizing things like career services or student financial assistance or your academic advisors if you have any concerns that maybe are getting in the way of your studying that relate to some things like that. Maybe if you're struggling to see how your major relates to your future career path, it might be a good time to talk to your advisor, or maybe career services. CAPS is a really awesome resource that if you just have a lot going on in your life, or maybe you're experiencing a lot of test anxiety or a lot of anxiety in general, they're a really good resource to kind of help you work through all of that. As well as utilizing your fellow Knights. I mentioned talking to other students in your class to see what works well for them. It might work out for you, it might not, but it's always good to see what everyone else is doing, just to see. And kind of on a closing note, the bad news is that time flies, so time can go by really fast, especially if you're trying to cram for a test. But the good news is that you're the pilot, so time flies, but you can drive it, you can fly it. Awesome. Does anyone have any closing questions, comments, concerns? Yes. Yeah, I can get. Yeah, I got you on that one. And then if anyone has any papers they need me to sign or anything to prove that they attended today, I will gladly fill those out as well. If you all could do me a favor, as you walked in, there were evals about the workshop on the end of every row. So if you didn't grab one, if you could grab one and fill it out, that'd be greatly appreciated. You can hand them up to me up front, and at that point I can show you the app and then show you and I can sign whatever I need to sign. So thank you all for coming out today. I hope you got something out of this workshop.